Hey guys, Bald Guy Sci here. This week I decided we'd do something a little bit different. We take the show on the road. So we're going to do a little roadside ecology today talking about succession. And here we go. All right, so in this idea of ecology, we have something called succession. Now, succession is really a term that applies to like kings, right? So in a kingdom, a king would be succeeded or followed up in the same kingdom by maybe his son or his brother or whatever.
Great idea! Who needs a king? No king, no king, la 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 la.
Idiots! There will be a king!
Hey, but you said
I will be king!
So the line of kings would be called succession. Well, communities do that in the environment. So the communities in an ecosystem will succeed one another if the conditions are right. Now, for a lot of reasons, the conditions aren't right, or the communities don't get succeeded and they kind of stay where they are. But when they get to that place where they reproduce themselves, or they no longer are succeeded by another community, then we call that climax community, or the high point, sort of like in a book or a movie where the climax is the most interesting or suspenseful part.
oh my God!
But the climax community is going to be determined by the abiotic factors involved. So if the conditions are right in every season for the amount of sunlight and rainfall and temperature and weather, then we'll reach a particular climax community. Now, sometimes we refer to those communities when they exist in like large areas as biomes. And you probably know the biomes like tundras and deserts and grasslands and forests, and there's a lot of different kinds of those things, but around the globe they're generally pretty similar to one another as far as the climax community that exists in that location. But the climax community can be thought of on a smaller scale too. So near my house is a wetland, but I generally live in a deciduous forest. So the reason the wetland never progresses is because it just simply can't, because there's too much moisture. The soil might be too wet all the time, and the species that generally live on dry land are not good competitors there compared to what it is. So farming is another example that prevents a climax community from being produced. Now, you are a tree murderer. I'm just going to let that sit in. You violent person. No, I'm kidding. Actually, I'm not. But every time you mow your lawn, you're murdering.
Oh my God!
You're killing trees. There's nothing wrong with that because we want our grass, right? But the trees are seeded there by the wind or animals or fruit or however they got their seeds dispersed. But those animals or those seeds, those trees would be growing, right? But we cut them down with a lawnmower. A farmer does the same thing when he plows up a field. But that issue is something we call biodiversity. So in your lawn, the diversity of plants that are in that living area, living, diversity, different kinds, is pretty low, because you're keeping it low and only allowing grasses and herbs to be there. And there might be the occasional rabbit or bird that visits your yard, but in other locations where that diversity is allowed to grow, you would have obviously much higher biodiversity. The climax community has the highest. There's a greater degree of habitats, a greater degree of niches to be fulfilled in that location. So biodiversity and succession go hand in hand. Okay, so as far as succession goes, there's two basic types. There's primary succession, which means it's happening for the first time, and there's secondary succession, which means it's sort of reestablishing itself. Now, primary succession is going to happen anywhere where there's bare rock and soil doesn't exist. So you might see this at times when a building collapses in a city, or a road has been abandoned, or maybe on the surface or the top of a mountain where there's some exposed rock. Now, I did a video like 10 years ago. That link is going to be appearing up here in just a second, on the top of one of the mountains in the Adirondacks. And so in the Adirondack Mountains, we have a lot of bare rock. Because of the elevation, succession sort of stalls out and isn't able to proceed as quickly as it might at lower elevations where the climate's more predictable, more consistent. So this behind me is a farmer's field, and as you can see, they've planted crops here. So they might come out, they might plow, they might spray to prevent the natural things from growing here so that we can have food. Now there's nothing wrong with that, but what we see here is extremely low biodiversity. Biodiversity means living diversity, or lots of different living things. So there's not a lot of populations here. In fact, it looks like mostly corn and a few things of weeds. But every time the farmer plows this under, it kills trees. Sorry. But if you see behind me, off in the distance by those windmills, we can see that the field would become a forest eventually if the farmer stopped plowing it under. So every time they interrupt this idea of succession, so it never makes it to the climax community. Hey, so just down the road, not even very far, you can see where this field over here behind me, the farmer just decided that maybe it was too wet, or they didn't need as much of the field that might happen to be over my right shoulder, and so they let it go. And now we might be 10 or 15 years into that process. The field, because those grasses weren't plowed under, is beginning to work its way back towards the climax community that's really just behind it. So we can see shrubs and small trees growing here, and the biodiversity is beginning to increase. There's other animals that would seek shelter or find food or whatever those things that they need. That's a different habitat than this one behind me. And even this one, which is a hay field, is different from the cornfield that we found just a little ways back. So this is a perfect example of roadside succession. These are aspen trees.
This is an aspen. You can tell that it's an aspen tree because of the way it is.
And these aspen trees are kind of a pioneer species of an area where the land has been let go and the field gives way to these easily dispersed seeds of trees nearby. This is a climax community. So I'm standing in the middle of a forest that's at various stages of succession. And as I sort of pan around, you'll notice that any place where a tree has maybe fallen down, a new one or younger ones are springing up. Where light reaches the surface of the ground, there are smaller plants, shrubs, things that are growing there because they can compete for the light. But this climax community is a self-reproducing community. It's not going to go any higher. That's what the word climax means. All right, well, I would say that was a successful video. Well, join us next week when we talk about biomes, how all of these large land areas on the planet have similar plants, animals, and other life forms and climate. But until then, it is time for me to kill some trees.